The way that we view reality was just fundamentally wrong about what a human being is, what this place is, why are we here, meaning and purpose. Is it really random? Do we survive when the body dies? Is there reincarnation? Are we all psychic and don't know it? Like, these are the kinds of questions that were really popping up for me that never previously were real questions, because I thought science had transcended all these things that might have been superstitious or religious or spiritual. I thought science had moved past that. The point here is that if consciousness is the basis of reality, it would make sense logically that the reality that we call physical, which might not even be actually physical, but we call it physical, that it's malleable, that is affected by the individual consciousnesses, and maybe by other things also. So that's a powerful idea, that we might actually be affecting humanity by doing our own improvements in our own consciousness.
Welcome back to a show dedicated to exploring the psychedelic space and the mysteries that expand our consciousness. My name is Jonas, and today I have the huge pleasure of interviewing Mark Gober, who's a researcher and an author who's published a number of books investigating the mystery of consciousness. In his books, such as An End to Upside Down Thinking, Gober investigates near-death experiences, past life memories, extrasensory perception, remote viewing, the entire field of parapsychology, and it is just truly fascinating stuff with enormous implications for our understanding of the nature of self, the nature of reality, the nature of mind, and some of life's biggest questions. If it really is true that there's more to what we are than the physical body, that we're spiritual beings in a temporary human lifetime, what do we do with that knowledge? I am really excited for this conversation, so let's dive right into it. Mark Gober, welcome. It is a huge honor and a pleasure to have you here today.
Jonas, thank you so much for having me.
I want to just say again, just such an appreciation and admiration to you and your work in the way that you've been bridging the gap between science and spirituality towards a new understanding of consciousness and the implications of this awareness for humankind on an individual and global scale. Immense and profound work. I've heard you discuss in previous conversations. Back in 2016, you underwent kind of a profound shift in your ontological worldview. For those who are new to your work, can you just touch briefly on what that was, how this all started for you, this investigation of consciousness, and what that was like?
Yeah, I'll walk you through the history, because the things we'll talk about for the majority of the interview were things that were not on my mind for most of my life up until 2016. So I have a very conventional background and just had an achievement-focused life. Growing up, I grew up outside of Baltimore, Maryland. I went to Princeton University after I graduated high school, and then I worked in investment banking in New York, starting in 2008 during the global financial crisis. But the epicenter arguably was in New York, because there was just so much happening there with just the financial system that was impacting the rest of the world. And I was at one of the banks that was both having problems itself, but also we were advising other financial institutions on their problems. So it was just complete chaos. And I ended up leaving in 2010 to join a firm based in Silicon Valley, where I was advising technology-focused companies on their innovations and their intellectual property. And throughout all that time, I just mentioned to you like what I was doing on the surface, but I didn't have a sense of meaning or purpose when I was doing all that stuff. I was just trying to achieve the next thing in front of me, because I was a competitive person and I just didn't know any other way of, well, like, I wasn't thinking about what's the purpose of life. I didn't really think that life had any fundamental meaning or purpose other than what we could make up in our own minds. Meaning, in other words, I didn't think there was meaning that was built into the fabric of reality itself. I thought we lived in a random and meaningless universe.
Right.
So that means that when you die, that's the end of your consciousness. That's the end of your state of being. And whatever you do in your life, whether pleasurable or suffering inducing, that's just how it is. And it became harder and harder to withstand the ups and downs of life with that perspective. Number one, it was hard to find the same kind of motivation that I had earlier in life, with not having a compass for why I was doing anything. But also, as life became more complicated and just got older, professionally and personally, it was harder to figure out what I was really doing. And that took me to 2016, which is maybe the epicrisis of all this. Maybe we could say a few years before that, I started to feel the dis-ease with all of it, where I was having more trouble pushing through. But in 2016, I started listening to podcasts. And at this point, I really felt like I was a zombie. And people on the outside probably would have said, well, like, Mark, your life's really good. What's going on here? You've had a great job. Life's good for you. But the inner state was not feeling satisfied. And I started listening to podcasts. Initially, it was random. A friend of mine, I remember he sent me a podcast from the Tim Ferriss show, and it was a venture capitalist, Mark Andreessen, talking about venture capital or something like that. So at that time, I said, wow, this is kind of an interesting thing. Maybe I could do something outside of the office where I'm not just focused on work all the time. I could listen to really smart people talk for hours, because at the time, podcasts were much newer. In 2016, not as many people were listening to them. So that was my entry point into podcasting. And then I listened to much more of Tim Ferriss's show, and he was talking about psychedelics a bunch. And I wasn't feeling comfortable diving into taking substances, but he talked about other things that were kind of mimicking it, like meditation or sensory deprivation tanks. And where I was living in San Francisco was not far from a sensory deprivation tank place. So I said, you know what, I'm going to try that just to explore, see what if anything happens. And I didn't have any crazy breakout experiences, but in hindsight, it probably opened up my mind in ways that I didn't appreciate at the time, because you're literally floating in salt water, and there's so much salt that your body doesn't sink. So you lay on your back in this little pod. It's a personalized pod. No one's in the room with you. There's actually a shower in the room. And I would close the lid of the pod like most people do. And then you can actually turn the lights off also. And you can either have music playing or not. I would go total silence, total darkness in this pod. And I definitely felt like some pleasurable sensations. Maybe I would see colors a little bit, but I didn't have what many people describe under psychedelics in terms of the experience. But those experiences and just my general interest in health, physical and mental health, led me to listen to other shows. And I would just I would look up shows on Apple Podcasts and see what were, you can see others that are similar to this, or sometimes people would reference a podcast. So I would end up on a bunch of different shows. And there was one called Extreme Health Radio, which is still on the air. And I was listening to a bunch of their podcasts on alternative ways that people were able to heal from things. And the next one up in the queue one day was a woman who had interviewed months before. Her name's Laura Powers, and she was speaking with the hosts about her psychic abilities and her ability to communicate with beings from other dimensions, that sort of thing. And I was really intrigued because I hadn't heard anyone talk about this sort of thing in a serious way. And I remember Laura's tone. She was speaking as if these were real experiences. It didn't strike me that she was lying about them. And then I couldn't figure out, is there delusion here? Because if anything that she said had reality to it, then whoa, like that, then the mainstream scientific picture of reality is way off.
Right.
So I listened to that episode, and I remember the hosts of the show at Extreme Health Radio. They're like, "Whoa!" Well, they were listening seriously too, and I heard how rigorous they were in other episodes. So I'm like, okay, they're taking her seriously. What's going on? And at the end of the episode, Laura says, "I have my own podcast called Healing Powers, where I've interviewed many other people who've had experiences like this too." So since I was in the mode of listening to podcasts, I downloaded her show. And long story short, I listened to every one of her episodes because they were not very long, maybe like 30 minutes on average, plus or minus. From 2016, when I first listened to her show, back to 2011, which were her earliest episodes. So I totally binged it. And I had a bunch of time in the car driving from San Francisco to Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of traffic. So I had a few hours every day to knock these out. And what I realized was that there were people all over the world from different backgrounds who were coming to a very similar picture of reality to the one that I heard Laura talk about. So then it became much more difficult for me to dismiss all of this, because these were people who had independent experiences, life experiences, and they're talking about the same thing. So I'm like, whoa, okay, is this collective delusion here? Like, what is happening? And in those episodes that where I heard Laura interview people, they often referenced books or scientific papers or other resources. So that led me to then read books and go on Amazon, order a bunch of stuff, look up scientific papers and read those. And I was just shocked that there was a whole area of science that I had no exposure to previously. I didn't even know anyone who knew about these things. And the implication was that the way that I and many people that I know and knew, the way that we view reality was just fundamentally wrong about what a human being is, what this place is, why are we here, meaning and purpose. Is it really random? Do we survive when the body dies? Is there reincarnation? Are we all psychic and don't know it? Like, these are the kinds of questions that were really popping up for me that never previously were real questions, because I thought science had transcended all these things that might have been superstitious or religious or spiritual. I thought science had moved past that. So a year into this research journey for me, this was the summer of 2017, still working in my job in Silicon Valley, but I did start to feel this. There was a big shift in my own worldview, because it was becoming harder and harder for me to dismiss what I was finding. And I decided, why don't I put this into a book? Because many people have written about these topics before, but because of my background, maybe I'll be a bridge for people, and they'll be willing to research or even look at this for 5 seconds, whereas previously they might have just dismissed it. And I'll write it like a real science book. And it was similar to what I used to do professionally, because I've since left my firm. But what I did was advised technology companies, and especially at the board of directors and senior management team level. So these are people who sometimes weren't fully technical. Some of them were, but some of them were just business-minded people. And we were looking at things that were both legal because of the intellectual property, but also technical because we were looking at new technologies that were basically replacing the existing technologies that were out there. So I had to look at complex stuff in electrical engineering, things that I didn't know about before, but I always had to learn about it and then be able to translate it for an audience that might have some inkling about how things work. But like, I had to be able to synthesize things and then also have all the citations.
Right.
So that was my background. I said, well, why don't I apply that to writing a book? Because this stuff's super important. Long story short, I wrote this book, and Ed to Upside Down Thinking is the name. And that was published in 2018. There were many synchronicities along the way. I was very fortunate to find a book agent and publisher very quickly. And so that's the story. That book came out in 2018, but I'll just take you to the present moment quickly, and then I'll pause. In 2019, I produced a podcast series, which is on the same topic as the book. It's called Where Is My Mind? And it's only 8 episodes. It's like a bingeable series. And even though it was published in 2019, the topics are, I think they're timeless, and that's why we made it the way we did.
Yeah.
But I interviewed many of the people that I wrote about, so scientists and very credible people, including a Nobel Prize winner in physics. So that was 2019. At the end of 2019, I was still in my job. I was a partner at the firm at this point, and I made a decision because I was so passionate about this other stuff that I wanted to leave my firm, not knowing what I would do next, but I wanted to have the space just to see what would emerge. And long story short, 6 new books have come out on a variety of other topics, from cosmology to medicine, politics, but they all tie into what I talk about in the first book, because consciousness and the nature of reality is, if that's the fundamental substrate or the fundamental backdrop for how we think about reality, it necessarily bleeds into those other topics.
Yes. Well, I have to say that this book here, An End to Upside Down Thinking, I really find it to be one of the most kind of cogent and clear and concise and accessible syntheses of all of these realms of all these domains of research into anomalous and extraordinary human experiences, or experiences of consciousness, from near-death experiences to past life memories, mediumship, the entire field of parapsychology. And as already expressed, just profound appreciation for this book. It was very impactful for me. What are some of the key takeaways that you might share that were kind of distilled in this book right here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's funny how, because the book is a bit more removed than the other ones, but these principles have also had more time to sink into me. And I would say the core of the topic is about the relationship between the brain and consciousness. That's really it. And that might seem like a really basic thing for those who haven't explored the questions here. And that was like me in 2016. I didn't know there were questions about the relationship between the brain and consciousness, because I thought that the brain creates consciousness and that neuroscience had clearly established it. And why did I believe that? Because we know from neuroscience that there's all kinds of activity in the brain, chemical and electrical activity. And we can correlate that activity with people's conscious experience. So we can, let's say, damage a part of the brain that's responsible for vision, and then the person has a change in eyesight. There's so many things where this can happen. And we say, look, we change the brain, we change consciousness. Obviously, the brain creates consciousness. What I didn't appreciate is that we can't make that conclusion. That's certainly one possibility, but it's not actually logical to say that because one thing is correlated to another, that thing causes it. So I'll give an example. This actually comes from a philosopher named Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He says, if you have a fire, lots of firefighters show up. If you have a bigger fire, there are more firefighters that show up. There's a strong correlation between the size of the fire and the number of firefighters that appear at the scene. Then he asks, do we then assume that firefighters are causing the fire? It sounds silly. We can laugh at that. But one might wonder, are we making those kinds of causal errors or errors in causal thinking, really, with regard to consciousness and many other areas? But consciousness is a big one. Now, let's just say, what if the brain's not creating consciousness, but just is correlated to it in some way? Then what would be another way to explain the observations? So there's no one who's denying that the brain's very much involved in the way we experience the world. The question is it producing consciousness? If it's not producing it, what's an alternative? And this one really struck me when I first heard the analogy. And I think I heard it from Dr. Gary Schwartz, who's like highly credentialed academically, Harvard, Yale, University of Arizona, in the field of psychology, I believe. And he had this analogy of, like, if you have an antenna, imagine damaging the antenna, and you're watching television, for example, and you damage the antenna. All of a sudden, the TV show that you're watching isn't appearing in a clear way on your screen. It's very scratchy. But it's not because the signal has been damaged. The only thing that was damaged was the apparatus, the machinery that was responsible for processing the signal. It's like, whoa, think about that for a second. What if that's analogous to the brain, that our brain might be picking up or processing or interfacing with or filtering something that's beyond the body? Then that would mean the brain and the body are actually somehow receiver transmitters, maybe. That means the body isn't it. That means we're tuning into or tapping into something beyond us. And this is really the core principle that helped me shift the way I look at reality, because it turns out there's a ton of evidence to suggest that the brain's not creating consciousness and that we're tuning into something.
Right. Yeah. I think there's like this really interesting and ironic thing that every single one of us is conscious, and yet no one seems to know what consciousness is.
Yeah.
It is the, arguably the single greatest mystery facing modern science today. Sure, it's a question that you're asked often. In your eyes, what do you see as the most compelling evidence that consciousness isn't produced by the brain, that the brain is more a antenna or receiver of consciousness?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me preface the answer with maybe a broader definition of consciousness. I'm glad you brought that up, because consciousness isn't something I can point to and show you what it is, whereas a brain we can point to. So consciousness is not physical. And this leads to what's actually known as the hard problem of consciousness in philosophy. Right. Chalmers came up with that. The hard problem is, and I'm paraphrasing, how is it that something that's non-physical, like consciousness, meaning it's an abstraction, we can't point to it, we can't touch it, how did that arise from something that's physical, like a brain? That's the big question. No one understands how that could even happen. And consciousness, the way I think about it, it's our sense of experiencing. So if I tell you, Jonas, I am speaking right now, or I have a thought, that sense of I is what I mean by consciousness. Yes. So it's actually not the thought, or it's not the sensation. It's that which experiences it. And then we can get into deeper questions about what is I? Is I just Mark? Is I Jonas? Or do we have the individual I that's part of a collective I, which is a deeper question. I think it's ultimately something like that. We're individuations of a broader consciousness. And so what led me, I would say the first piece of evidence, and maybe the strongest, relates to near-death experiences. And these are instances in which a person has some kind of trauma to the body. So it could be cardiac arrest, meaning blood stops flowing to the brain. Often the person's clinically dead. It's some kind of major trauma, whether it's cardiac arrest or otherwise. And a person comes after being resuscitated. The person says, I just experienced something that was beyond words. I cannot put it into human language. I experienced something that was realer than real life. I could see in 360-degree vision, like omnidirectional vision. Sometimes actually people who've been blind since birth have come back and said these sorts of things they can see, and then they go back to being blind. I mean, really wild stuff. But the part of the near-death experience that really captured my attention in terms of trying to get to real solid proof is that sometimes people have an out-of-body experience with their near-death state before being resuscitated. And in that out-of-body experience, their consciousness is outside their body, sometimes hovering over it, where they can see or even hear or just perceive things from that vantage point. Sometimes it's even outside the room that they're in. And when they're resuscitated, their consciousness comes back in and they're able to tell the doctor or family members or bystanders what happened accurately. And if it's accurate, their memory or their perception, that means that it's not a hallucination. Because the skeptic would hear this stuff and say, yeah, they obviously had a hallucination. But if they perceive something accurately from a vantage point outside their body during the time that their brain should have been off or barely functional, whoa. These are known as veridical out-of-body experiences. And veridical is a fancy way of saying a verified memory. So veridical out-of-body experiences. There's a book called The Self Does Not Die that has over 100 of these cases documented. And some of your listeners might say, well, that doesn't seem like very many. That's true, but if there's even one case, that makes us question the paradigm because this should never happen. And also, it's very difficult to document this sort of thing because if a person's dying, I mean, you're trying to get them better. You just want to help them survive. So when they're resuscitated, there's so many things you would need in order to have a well-documented case. And to me, it's really about time stamping in terms of having convincing evidence. What do I mean by time stamping? If you know when the memory occurred that the person is talking about, you can know what their physiology was doing. So you can be able to say, oh, this was the memory they had. The doctor said that's true. And we know their body was doing X, Y, and Z. Yeah, that body should not have been capable of producing a complex memory, let alone one from a vantage point outside the body, let alone one that's accurate in light of all those things. So there have been documentations of this. And to me, that is evidence of a clear, lucid, non-hallucinatory consciousness without a functional brain. Okay. Right. That's serious. And let me just preface here, there are many credible people who have studied this. Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, Dr. Jan Holden from the University of North Texas, Pim van Lommel, who is a Dutch cardiologist, and one of his papers was published in the Lancet Medical Journal on near-death experiences in cardiac arrest survivors. So this is serious stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of these cases of veridical perceptions during near-death experiences are just truly extraordinary, right? Of like observing the location of a tennis shoe on a hospital ledge, right? Or correctly reporting on, a conversation that loved ones were having at miles distant from the hospital, right? Or from where their physical body is located. So, I would completely agree. Even just having one of these experiences is sufficient to really begin to ask deeper questions here, right? Are there any cases of veridical perception or veridical out-of-body experiences during near-death experience that kind of stick out in your mind that really made an impact?
Yeah, there's one that just pops into my mind that Dr. Bruce Grayson from UVA tells, where he was the person, upon being resuscitated, said that the doctor who was operating on him was flapping his wings, and he was like, "This is really." Most people said, "Oh, that's weird," but they went back to the doctor. I can't remember how it happened. I think Dr. Grayson was just interviewing the doctor and was like, "Can you explain to me what happened?" And there was something about the way he was cleaning his gloves, where from above it would look like he was flapping his wings. So just a very bizarre details that were accurate in that case.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, that's just one piece of the extraordinary data and evidence that comes from the field of research into near-death experiences. I mean, cases of spontaneous healing, of lifelong conditions, what are known as peak and Darien experiences, right? Of connecting with a deceased relative not known to be deceased at the time of the experience. Just some really, really compelling anecdotes.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned those experiences of seeing a person not known to have been deceased, because again, that's another kind of verified veridical experience where, wait, how else could that knowledge have been obtained? It suggests that something about liberating the brain from its normal state. When you get the brain out of the way, perhaps these other pieces of information become available that are beyond space and time. Those are super compelling. And these have been written about by Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia again. And when you talk about spontaneous healing, that's a big one too. The case that comes to mind for me is the most famous one, arguably, Anita Moorjani, who was dying of terminal cancer,
Right.
had tumors all over her body. She had a
Right.
profound near-death experience in her coma and had major shifts in her mindset about herself. She encountered her deceased father. So arguably resolved a lot psychologically, probably resolved conflicts. And then when she came back into her body, her tumors disappeared. So we have something going on, man, at a level of consciousness and or energy that seem to resolve physical symptoms. I mean, the implications for medicine are very profound.
The idea of extrasensory perception, of remote viewing, of telepathic abilities. What this is another kind of area of research that you discuss and share and synthesize in a really amazing way in your writing. I'm curious, just as I bring that up, like what comes to mind for you?
First thing is the United States government's psychic spying program, which has now been declassified. That was a big one for me when I was researching this stuff initially, and I was very skeptical. I'm like, well, okay, if this stuff's real, it's so big, how could this not be all over the news? How could it be that I majored in psychology at Princeton and I never heard about this stuff? I was having a lot of cognitive dissonance where I couldn't reconcile this stuff. And then I saw that there were declassified documents about the United States government's alleged psychic spying program. And anyone can access these. I actually include them in the book you showed in End Upside Down Thinking. And they say remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary. These are direct quotes from the US government. So that's quite remarkable because what they're describing in remote viewing is the ability for the mind to see or perceive things that are far away in space and or time. That means you're sitting in your chair with your mind, you can know about something that's far away. Whoa, in the past, present, or future. So it suggests that consciousness is clearly not limited to our brain, and it seems to transcend whatever we know about space-time. And more than that, the US government spent over $20 million on this program. And in my podcast series, I interviewed Russell Targ, who was one of the leaders of the program. And, you know, when I talk to him or someone like Dean Radin, so I'm also on the board of an organization called the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which I never knew existed. It's been around for 50 years, also studying this stuff, using controlled studies and have peer-reviewed papers. Whoa. But when I talk to people that have been involved in these programs and actually running studies, there's no question. To them, it's about, yeah, obviously it's real and the skeptics can do what they want. Like we've seen it, we've been there, we know this stuff's real. But the question is, what's the mechanism for it? How does it work? When is it more effective? When's it less effective? Those are the things that they're really asking. But that was powerful for me to see that those who are actually in it, it's not helpful for them career-wise to talk about these things because there's such taboo around it. So it's not like they're often called pseudoscientists. It's really terrible what's done to some of these very, I think, brave individuals. So there's not benefit to it versus studying something in the mainstream and you get all this funding for it. And yet they have such conviction because they've been exposed to it and they have a very honest scientific approach where they want to understand it.
Right. Even on a kind of, empirical statistical level, you have people like Dr. Jessica Utz and others who are conducting these kind of meta-analyses of data from several decades of research into remote viewing and finding that statistically the odds of these findings occurring by chance is one in billions, if not trillions. And it speaks to this kind of like untapped domain of human potential, maybe not fully untapped. Some people have access to it clearly, but can you speak to what the possibility, this extraordinary possibility, what I would regard as this extraordinary reality that we do have psychic abilities in some sense of that term? To you, what does that say about human potential?
It says a lot. It says to me that we all have this within us. And there might be a spectrum of abilities where some people are maybe, just like someone in sports, might be more naturally athletic. That's one area where it's just there's natural ability and the spectrum of that. But then also people can practice seemingly and get better if they just know how to do it. But most of us are not trained in that. And I want to emphasize what you said about these meta-analyses. And Dr. Jessica Utz, for example, she's the 2016 president of the American Statistical Association. So to me, again, as an outsider, if someone's going to evaluate whether statistics are viable and we should be paying attention to them, it's her. And what she said, I've memorized this because I've said it so many times and it's so impactful to me. She said, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. Let me repeat that. Using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. That's her conclusion. And it's gotten to the point now where certain peer-reviewed journals, even though many of them are resistant to this stuff, are accepting the results. And the example I often point to is a 2018 paper published by Etzel Cardenia, and it was in American Psychologist, the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the American Psychological Association. And again, this is showing statistical evidence that people are able to do things psychically beyond what chance would predict. And that last clause is really important, beyond what chance would predict, because they're not talking about 100% accuracy with psychic abilities.
Of course.
And you get a skeptic who's maybe not familiar with the stuff, and if a psychic does something wrong one time, they'll be like, okay, yeah, psychics aren't real. I just proved it. That's not the argument that's being made here. The point is that if you look at many, many trials, can people do things or obtain information that we can't explain beyond what chance would predict? And that's what seems to be the case. So in studies on telepathy, I'll give the classic study. It's called the Gonsfeld experiment, where you have people, they're in two rooms. Say Bob is in one room and the researchers put him into a relaxed state. And the other person is Jane. Jane's in a room far away. And the experimenters are showing Jane an image. And they ask Jane, who, by the way, doesn't claim to have psychic abilities. In most of these studies, like Dean Radin told me, it's like college sophomores. These are people, they're just everyday people. They're putting them in the lab. And they ask Jane to try to mentally send what she's seeing to Bob in the other room. And Bob doesn't know what she's looking at. So then after a while, Bob comes out of his relaxed state and the experimenters say, hey, Bob, we're going to show you 4 images. Which is the one that Jane was trying to mentally send to you? And the person who's in Bob's room over many, many trials, we would guess, should guess correctly about 25% of the time. It should approach 25%, which is 1 out of 4, because that's what chance would predict. Like, how could the person in Bob's room get any information from Jane? She's not speaking to him. That's all controlled for. How could there be information that's transmitted psychically? What happens is that the person in Bob's room guesses correctly around 32% of the time, plus or minus. From a statistical standpoint, it's massively significant. It's in the realm of what Dr. Dean Radin calls 6 sigma results. So it's more than 1 billion to 1 against chance. Again, it's a small effect, but highly statistically significant, which means that something sometimes is getting through from one person to another. And these are people that don't claim to have special abilities often. And then you have people in the psychic spying program who are probably much better than 32%, but maybe still not 100%. The implication here, like I said at the beginning of this, answering your question, is that we all have these abilities to some degree. And what could happen if we all harness them? Because I do think that most people have experiences that are a little bit strange, but it's easy to dismiss them because it might just be that 7% differential of the 32 versus the 25, where it's like, okay, yeah, I was thinking of that person I haven't talked to in years, and then that person texted me. But yeah, that can happen because there's randomness in the universe. And we've all had these strange synchronicities, but looked at from this perspective, that maybe it's like some of the information that's getting through that we're not always, we don't see it, so we don't understand it. It's like something is entering our consciousness, entering our brain, if you want to say, a little bit of signal that we don't understand where it comes from. And the implications are just incredibly profound because it implies that mainstream science is just completely off base in terms of how it understands a human being.
Right. And again, of course, is further very compelling empirical evidence that consciousness isn't produced or generated by the brain, that there's a deeper mystery here. And really just sitting with that reality, ostensibly what we're looking at here is scientific proof of the reality of psychic abilities, which I can't wrap my mind around how that's not front page news, how this isn't, to be sure, that revelation is one of the most significant and game-changing in all of human history, in our awareness of the nature of reality and the nature of self, right? You said something there, kind of like, what might happen if we learn to harness that? Maybe that there's a lot potentially to be said there, but what kind of pops into your mind as you say that?
First thing to me is that the implication is that we all have innate power. And we live in a world where sometimes it feels like any individual just feels insignificant. And I think this is all extremely empowering to the individual, which is a positive thing. And it might make us more curious too about the nature of what we are and what we're doing here and how we should be living our lives. Because all of a sudden, if we realize that there was this massive thing that we didn't understand about ourselves, what else might be there that we should know that we don't?
What's really striking to me is just the weight of this kind of interdisciplinary evidence from all these, seemingly disparate fields of study, near-death experiences over here and like UFOs and UAP over here. And somehow it's all presenting this consistent message that there's more to the consciousness within each one of us than physical body and brain. In your estimation, Mark, do you sense that we're on the cusp of a paradigm shift here when it comes to the science of consciousness? Is it your sense that there's still just like a tremendous amount of resistance to these ideas, and that all these domains of kind of parapsychological research will sort of remain at the margins for some time yet to come?
I do think there's still a lot of resistance to this. There's probably more momentum than when I first started researching it, but I do see among, let's just say, established academia, which really does help to control or influence the narrative otherwise, where it's stuck in the materialist paradigm, that these things that we might call psychic phenomena or otherwise, those are just pseudoscience. They're not real. But I agree with you that the weight of the evidence, that's what drew me in, because I would read a book on children with past life memories written by a professor at the University of Virginia, and then read another book on telepathic abilities and another one on mediumship. And they do seem like they're somewhat separate. They're similar in that they're weird compared to the mainstream paradigm, but they're these separate disciplines. And what I started to appreciate when I researched is that, wow, they all relate to the relationship between consciousness and the brain. They're just different ways of exploring it. And that's how I ended up writing the book.
Right.
It ended upside down thinking, because I said, oh, they're not actually disparate. They seem like they are, but they're not.
Right.
And I don't know what the solution is exactly in terms of helping to bring about more awareness. I think programs like yours are super important. So thank you for doing what you're doing to help raise awareness, because I do think it will start from a grassroots perspective where it's the individuals are going to wake up. And then because of that, it will bleed into the broader society. But I just don't think the system, which has an extreme bias, is necessarily going to move quickly toward a paradigm shift.
Right. Right. How do you approach a conversation with someone who's coming from a really kind of like cynical, skeptical, materialist, almost dogmatically so, orientation that, no, this is ridiculous, and it's clear that the brain produces consciousness, and this is all just pseudo. How do you approach a conversation with someone like that?
Well, number one is that I don't even have many conversations like that anymore, because unless the person's really being honest and willing to engage, the conversation doesn't go anywhere, because the person is not willing to have a paradigm shift. So my first thing is to gauge where someone is. And if they're in a hardcore skeptic position where they're not going to budge, often there's not much that I can do. So I have to acknowledge that first. But there are people who are skeptical who say, look, I'm actually open to this. I want to understand where you're coming from. That's interesting to me. And where I like to start with people like that is where I started. What would be the most credible thing to talk about with it? And to me, it starts with something that we can maybe get on the same page about, which is the hard problem of consciousness. You can look at any philosopher, psychologist, neuroscientist. They will acknowledge there is a hard problem of consciousness. We don't truly understand how a physical brain could produce a non-physical consciousness. Not well understood. Many of them might say, well, we don't understand it, but that's just because we're still researching and eventually we will. It's known as promissory materialism to say that. It's like we promise in the future it will happen, but we don't have evidence now. But in any event, I think that you can start there to say, look, there is this big question about consciousness. And they'll say, okay, that's true. And then depending on who I'm talking to, I might throw out like the near-death experience research, the US government psychic spying program, Jessica Utts and the credibility of her work, and then some of the peer-reviewed research. So I might go through a few of those. University of Virginia having a division of perceptual studies since the 1960s, studying this stuff. Whoa. But another person, depending on how they think, I would make a philosophical argument. Because for some people, the scientific stuff, they'll say, well, that's anecdotal and I don't like the way they did the methodology. What I'm about to say now is probably the hardest thing to understand. But when it lands, I think it's the most powerful. Okay, so the philosophical argument, I think it's made best by Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who I mentioned before.
Sure.
He calls this philosophy analytic idealism. And from a broader sense, it's known as idealism, meaning what is the nature of reality in a philosophical sense as it pertains to consciousness? And the mainstream perspective that I used to have, and many in academia have, it's known as scientific materialism. Some would call it physicalism,
Right.
which is that all of reality can be reduced to physical stuff because there was a big bang and it filled the universe with physical things that were bumping into each other. And when lots of things bump into each other after billions of years, you end up with Darwinian evolution, where one thing moves to the next. And then you end up with a human being, and you have a human being that develops a brain. And from the brain, consciousness pops out. So in that whole chain, we started with physical stuff. That's materialism, physicalism. That's the mainstream paradigm. And that paradigm says consciousness comes from the brain. Under idealism, you flip the script and you say, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the universe and there's biology and neuroscience and chemistry, but we got consciousness wrong. Consciousness should come at the very beginning, and that everything we call physical is emerging from consciousness itself. And the philosophical argument that Kastrup makes from it, from this perspective, is that it is more parsimonious to start with consciousness than it is to start to matter. And what he means by parsimonious is that if you use Occam's razor, which is that the simplest solution is usually the best, then you have to go with consciousness first, not matter first. And how does he get there? He says, basically, again, this one, I had to think about it and re-listen to this and reread it probably 20 times before it sunk in. So if your audience is interested in this, you might re-listen to what I say here, because it can take time to sink in. Consciousness is something that we all know because we have it right now. In philosophical terminology, it's an ontological category that's known to us. We know consciousness because we experience it. So when I see you or see other people on the street, I don't know for sure that they are having consciousness too, but because I know the ontological category of consciousness, because I experience it, it's a reasonable inference to say that other people are conscious also, and they're not just zombies who are faking consciousness. They could be, but it's a reasonable inference to say, I know consciousness, everyone else, they're probably conscious too. So now we're good there because we still haven't left the domain of consciousness. But where mainstream academia goes next is they say, well, there's also a world that exists independently of and outside of consciousness,
Right.
i.e., there was a universe before consciousness emerged way later. And they say it is from that universe, that material world that's independent of and outside consciousness, that consciousness arose. So that world created consciousness through all kinds of physical processes. And what Kastrup says is that, sure, there could be this world that pre-existed consciousness that exists outside of and independently of consciousness, but we could never know it. What does he mean by that? We could never know it because in order to know or verify something, you'd have to experience it. And if we're talking about a world that is by definition something that was never experienced or experienceable because it's totally outside consciousness, you're talking about something you could never verify. It becomes a totally new, what he calls ontological category of a material world that's independent of and outside consciousness that you could never verify. So if you want to believe the current paradigm of materialism or physicalism, you have to end up invoking all of these extra assumptions about the nature of reality. This whole world that would go on merrily if all consciousness disappeared, that we would never know because we could never verify it. And what he says is, we can explain reality perfectly by just sticking with consciousness and saying that we're all interconnected as some kind of unified stream of consciousness and we're all individual whirlpools within it. We can explain all of reality that way. We don't have to invoke all these extra assumptions of a world that exists outside of and independent of consciousness that we could never verify. Therefore, if we want to be good philosophy students, we go with Occam's razor. We stick with consciousness rather than having this material world that's outside of and independent of it. That is a strong argument if you want to be philosophical, because it is true. It becomes a leap of faith then to say that there is any material world outside consciousness. You just have to say, well, yeah, I think it would be there if all consciousness stopped. I just think it would be. And it becomes religious. So interestingly, Albert Einstein, He said this in a conversation with Tagore, who was I believe a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, like a mystic, Nobel Peace Prize winner or something like that, but a famous mystic. And Albert Einstein, who was a materialist, he used the term realism, which is that there was a real world outside consciousness, very similar to materialism. He said, I cannot prove that my conception is right, but that is my religion. So he acknowledges right there that the materialist view is a form of religion. And that's the irony when you talk to someone who's skeptical, because they often are so anti-religion, so anti-spirituality, and yet the foundations of their belief system, the whole basis of it, which is religious. And what they often say is, well, just like grant me this one miracle that I can't explain, and I'll explain everything else afterwards.
Right. Right. Mm. Yeah, I'm just taking a moment to let that sink in. Yeah. I mean, I think the fundamental nature of consciousness is kind of obvious in that philosophical sense. Given that I work in the psychedelic space, I'm curious how you view the potential utility of psychedelics as tools for the exploration of the nature of consciousness and reality.
Great question. It's an area that I don't have, like it hasn't been my deep dive. So what I'm going to say here is probably from a place of not knowing as much as you do, but I'll just give you my general perspective, because I've also seen a lot of people that have had these experiences, and there are clearly many beneficial cases where people have transformations in a positive way in their life. So there's something here, and there's a reason there have been ancient uses of various forms of psychedelics. So I think that's my umbrella statement with it. And then like anything, there can be abuses of it or improper uses, where if it's not done in the right way, people can have traumatic experiences that can be damaging for the long term too. So I know the terminology is set and setting for this sort of thing, and that seems paramount for sure. And then if we take it to the next level of like, what are people actually encountering? That's where I get really interested, because to me, psychedelics seem to be gateways to other realms of consciousness that our brain is perhaps ordinarily blocking out. So it's like if we're whirlpools within a stream, a psychedelic can give a peek into a broader part of the stream that we normally can't see, in a similar way that the near-death experience can open up a broader reality. However, Dr. Bruce Grayson from UVA talks about this, because some people will claim that maybe the near-death experience is just psychedelics being produced in the brain somehow, or chemicals. And what they find, the researchers find, that when you study people who have psychedelic experiences, they're unable to match every element of the near-death experience state. The closest one is apparently ketamine, but even that has many differences between the near-death experience. So you might hear people come back from a psychedelic account and they will use similar language, and you might say, oh, well, they just had a near-death experience, or they're like the same thing. But in reality, there are differences experientially in it. So when I talk about opening the veil, there might be different ways of opening the veil, or maybe the veil is multidimensional. So I don't know how that all works. But what I wonder is, these other worlds, are they always benevolent? Are they sometimes manipulative? Are they sometimes dangerous? I don't know. But for example, Dr. Rick Strassman, who wrote DMT, the spirit molecule, he studied DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and was giving it intravenously. So it's a pretty intense thing to do for this extremely powerful compound, where people were going to this other world, like way out there, for maybe 15 minutes or something, and they would come back in. And I write about this in my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, which is about contact with non-human intelligence. And what Rick Strassman realizes, whoa, these people are having contact with beings, and there are similarities, and it's not always positive. And he basically said, look, I don't know what's going on here. Ethically, I need to stop this study because I don't know what I'm subjecting people to. So this is a long-winded way of saying I think there's a lot of potential here, and there's a lot of things that we might not understand about these other worlds that I'm very curious about, but it's perhaps at a level of complexity that our human mind is not accustomed to thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that align with your experience at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see, I kind of conceptualize as psychedelics as tools, which, as you say, can, any tool is kind of neutral and can be used in ways that are kind of effective and useful, or in ways that are damaging, like a hammer, right?
Yes.
I more specifically, I see psychedelics as analogous to a telescope, just in the same way that we use a telescope to see more deeply into the cosmos. As a telescope more deeply into the mind, into the unconscious, into the subconscious, and into what could potentially be regarded as the collective unconscious, even what are referred to as transpersonal domains beyond our kind of limited biographical life story, beyond this physical human lifetime. And yeah, I have a particular interest in NN-DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and Rick Strassman's work. It's something I talk a lot about on my channel, and was a profoundly transformative experience for me, which is really a big part of the reason why I'm here having this conversation right now. But yeah, I wanted to. I was just getting ready to kind of ask you about this because, yeah, according to kind of, uh, qualitative research into the DMT experience, there are clear phenomenological links in the core features of the DMT experience with the near-death experience, right? There are important differences as well, of course, but clear phenomenological links, as well as to the UFO or UAP contact or abductee, which again, we have these seemingly vastly disparate kind of sources of experience and evidence that are all aligning somehow. And I think I've yet to read an End to Upside Down Contact,
Okay.
but I think I've heard you mention John Mack's work and his research into UFO contactees or abductees, as well as the way, before his untimely death, he penned a letter kind of discussing Rick Strassman's book into DMT, the spirit molecule, and acknowledging some of the remarkable phenomenological similarities between the DMT experience and UFO or UAP contactee experiences. Just in a broad sense, I'm curious what comes to mind for you as I mentioned that. Do you see a linkage there between these data sets in a way that seems legitimate?
Yeah, in fact, for me, the linkage was one of the most powerful parts of researching that book, An End to Upside Down Contact, because I had heard about DMT, I had heard about abduction experiences, and John Mack, medical doctor, former head of psychiatry at Harvard, who late in his career was exposed to allegations that people were abducted by aliens, which I know sounds insane. He wrote a book about this called Abduction, and another called Passport to the Cosmos. They're very academically done, very meticulous. And reading those books were very powerful to me. And he describes these abduction experiences that people are coming to him with incredible detail. And the people that he was working with were not people who were they weren't given DMT. And there are many questions that he and others have raised, which is, are the abductions physical or are they just in consciousness? Because some people, when they had the abductions, didn't seem to move physically, and others, maybe they were taken physically. So there's a lot of questions about what does it even mean to be physical? What are these experiences? But I mention this because in the DMT encounters, people were not being moved physically. It was just they were being injected with DMT, and they had experiences just like the ones that John Mack was hearing from people who were not taking DMT. So John Mack, like you alluded to, endorsed Rick Strassman's book, DMT, the spirit molecule. So when I saw that, I said, this is wild, because also Rick Strassman didn't know much about the abduction phenomenon. It sounded like to him it was maybe wacky and too far out there. And many of the subjects in his experiments who were taking DMT were not familiar with the abduction experience. Right. And the encounters of sometimes being like on a surgical table, at least in their consciousness, and having unpleasant experiences often with these beings. That was what John Mack saw too. So to me, it's powerful when you have this corroboration from disparate areas, when you're talking about something this seemingly crazy, that maybe there's a reality to it that's just beyond imagination. And if there is something to it, what does that say about what a human being is? Where do we exist in the broader, I don't know, multidimensional place that we're in? If people could have these very vivid experiences that just seem too crazy to be true, where they're interacting with advanced beings. Whoa, what's going on here? And that's why I think John Mack became obsessed later in his life on this topic, and many other people get hooked on it because it rocks the foundations of what we're all taught starting as kids.
Yes. Hypothetically, if someone can use a substance like DMT or any other kind of modality for shifting our consciousness and having subjectively an out-of-body experience, where subjectively, I'm traveling to this alternate realm or plane of existence beyond the physical universe and encountering what seem to be autonomous, highly intelligent, you know, viscerally real beings that often seem hyper advanced. Hypothetically, might it be possible that these hyper advanced beings also have some tool or modality of traversing the other direction, like the UFO phenomenon? How does that land with you?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to it, that these are more advanced beings in many ways. Doesn't mean they're perfect, and that can be a confusion sometimes
Right.
to almost deify the beings because they're more
Right.
advanced technologically, but maybe they have the same foibles that humans do and have the same desires and power, hungriness, and that sort of thing. But one of the commonalities in contact encounters with these quote unquote higher beings is that they communicate telepathically.
Yes.
So they are clearly advanced in consciousness in ways that the everyday human is not. And that, when you combine it with the way that they seem to interact and that the human beings view them in this way, that they're more advanced, that maybe they are interacting with our world in ways that we just don't understand. So the UAP phenomenon, where you have crafts doing things that we can't fully explain, certainly there's the possibility of secret government programs, and that's a whole rabbit hole. But also, you could have other types of intelligence that are just manipulating reality in ways that we think are too wild to be true, but they just understand the technology in a different way, where they can perceive reality differently. And I liken it to the novella Flatland, where it's set on a piece of paper, basically,
Yeah,
a two-dimensional world. And if you imagine that a sphere intersects with that world, initially the point of intersection of a sphere and a flat plane is just a point. So everyone in the flat world, when they see that point, they will study the point, they'll research it, and they'll be like, look, we understand that point fully. But they've missed the whole sphere because they're at a level of dimensional perception that can't see the other reality of the full sphere. And likewise, if the sphere goes further down, you end up with a circle of intersection on the plane. You don't have the full sphere. And likewise, the people in Flatland, the two-dimensional world, they can study the circle, they can do all the experiments they want, they can understand the circle fully, and they miss the full sphere. So I do wonder with these kinds of accounts, even just trying to talk about it, if we're like those people in Flatland trying to understand the circle, and no matter what we do, there's going to be the spherical elements, the other multidimensional parts that we either can access with the human mind, or maybe we just get glimpses of through these otherworldly experiences. But even those otherworldly experiences on psychedelics or meditation or near-death experience, is there another level of dimensionality beyond what's experienced there that we don't get? It might be so complex that we're only scratching the surface.
Yeah, I think that is likely the case. Yeah, so as it sits, I mean, we have people like Dr. Jacques Vallée, who, over the years are presenting really compelling evidence from, again, empirical data and evidence that the UFO phenomenon seems to be much stranger than physical nuts and bolts craft and beings from other planets, that this seems to be interdimensional somehow, or even weirder than that in a way that is hard to conceptualize. Then we have, the work of Dr. Rick Strassman, where people are anecdotally experiencing these alternate planes and realms of existence subjectively. And then we have John Mack, who even is going so far as to make specific linkages between the types of entities that people are encountering in these alternate realms, such as these little gray beings, these beings of light or energy, right? These reptilian beings, or these insect-like, mantid-like beings. It's just, again, a fascinating correspondence here. In your view, how do you characterize or conceptualize the potential linkage between the mystery of consciousness and the UFO or UAP phenomenon?
I think it's critical, and often in the public discourse on UAPs, UFOs, we're hearing about physical crafts and trying to understand those physical elements, and I do think that's important, but often the consciousness piece is left out, because in contact experiences, consciousness is just, it is a fundamental aspect of whether it's in a near-death experience, people will encounter beings of light or whatever it is. And like you said, in other types of encounters, people will see a mantid being or a gray being, reptilian beings. There are statistics on this in terms of what people have actually encountered. Ray Hernandez and his colleagues have done studies on these contact modalities.
Yep.
Pretty wild stuff. But I wonder also about the manipulation of consciousness in all this. because there's a phenomenon known as a screen memory, and they've been studied by Mike Cleland and others. Mike Cleland's work often focuses on owls. And a screen memory is basically where a person, the example he gives is like a person goes to the side of the road, they're driving, and they're like, oh, there's a really interesting owl here. And they look at the owl, and then all of a sudden, hours have passed. They go home, and they're like, what happened? Last thing I remember, I saw an owl. Then some of those people will say, I want to try to recover my memories of what happened during that missing time. So they might hire a hypnotherapist to say, maybe you can take me back in my mind so I can re-remember what I've forgotten. And the hypnotherapist will say, like, I want you to be super relaxed. I want you to, all the things you'd hear in hypnotherapy. And they'll say, I want you to go back to that scene where you saw the owl. Can you go up to the owl and describe what the owl looks like? And the person will say, wait a second, that's not an owl. It's a gray alien. So the potential implication here is that these beings could create in our memory something that's not real about what we experienced. They could actually manipulate our consciousness. And it also relates to a phenomenon known as shape shifting, that a being could appear to us one way, but not actually be that way. And John Mack, again, head of psychiatry at Harvard, in his book, he wrote that the alien beings appear to be consummate shapeshifters. It's a theme that comes up everywhere. And if you look at religious and spiritual lore, it comes up in all the mythologies, quote unquote mythologies. Maybe they're actually describing what happened. So if we introduce this manipulation of consciousness, it's very difficult to know what's going on because we, in that sense, can't even fully trust our memories. We don't know exactly what happened because we don't know if a screen is being created in our memory to manipulate what we experienced, and or we don't know if what we did see at the time was a manipulation of a higher being that was creating some kind of a manipulation of the reality that we were in.
Right. Right. What do you think are the potential spiritual implications of the UFO phenomena?
John Mack talked about this a lot with regard to abductions, because often the abductions were traumatic. And there were even many discussions about hybridization programs in the people that John Mack and others who have talked to, where the alien beings were actually trying to create hybrids of part human, part alien. And there was sexual trauma, taking of eggs and sperm, and actually insemination in some cases. So I mention all these traumatic things because that was a big part of it. And some people look at the abduction phenomenon as exclusively negative. But John Mack and some others have seen that there have been spiritual awakenings that can occur in spite of the trauma, almost like a near-death experience. Because a near-death experience is, of course, traumatic. The person almost dies and they have to recover their body, but they might have some kind of an awakening where, like Anita Morjani, she heals from cancer, or Darien Brinkley, who became a hospice volunteer after being much more materialistic previously. And actually, in his life review, he was, in his near-death experience, was reliving his own experience of killing someone in combat in Vietnam and reliving the event through the person's eyes that he killed, and also feeling the pain of children that no longer had a father because he had killed the father. He went through all that in his near-death experience and then came back and became a hospice volunteer. So there's something profoundly transformative in some of these mystical states in spite of the trauma. But it's hard to know, net what's going on, because are the beings trying to create spiritual awakenings in us? Or in some cases, are they actually trying to traumatize us and maybe enslave us or do something nefarious? It might be that there's a broad spectrum here, that the alien beings, whatever you want to call them, spirits, angels, interdimensional beings, that some might want to help humanity, others might want to harm humanity, others might just be looking out for themselves and don't really care one way or the other. But it just might be a multidimensional game that we're a part of, rather than just human civilization and turning on the news and seeing what's happening there. It could be multi-leveled and multi-layered in terms of the influences here. That's where I land. And the only way we can get there is by looking at consciousness.
Yeah. Many people point to, kind of a linkage between this experience and the evolution of human consciousness, or even the spiritual awakening of human consciousness. By no means do I believe that this is all like light and love and, everyone here is playing nice and is friendly. I think it's incredibly complex. But it kind of leads me to want to ask you about sort of this idea of like the evolution of human consciousness right now. As a collective, there seems to be almost like this growing malaise of crises and issues and kind of increased polarization. right? And I'm wondering, it's a big question, but maybe just in broad strokes, how you see this kind of new understanding of consciousness pertaining to, affecting the human collective on a global scale and pertaining to this idea of like a great awakening.
Hmm. Like you say, it's probably incredibly complex and maybe multifaceted where there's no one answer to it. You could have some beings that are trying to help awaken humanity and others that are trying to suppress it. But there's no doubt that, like I mentioned with John Mack's work and also Kenneth Ring, he did the Omega Project, which was
Yeah.
comparing near-death experiences to UFO encounters. And there were many seemingly positive transformations that occurred in spite of the trauma. And we could extend that on a um, macrocosmic level, where all the trauma we experience in the world, maybe that's being induced on other levels of reality to help us grow in some way.
Mm,
The flip side of that is that I've heard many people theorize that perhaps we are enslaved in some way, and the suffering is actually here to keep us down, and that dark beings feed off of our suffering and actually can keep us trapped here or something. All this stuff I find really difficult to validate one way or the other. Like if I were trying to convince a skeptic, it becomes very much circumstantial and based on people's mystical experiences, which we can't fully trust because we don't even know what they're experiencing in these other realms. They're using human language to describe something they even say. Often they can't even use language to describe it. So we're already off there. We don't know if their experience was manipulated in some way. So we end up in the realm of extreme inference. And where I land on it is that it ultimately is on the individual to just do the work to evolve. However we do it, whether it's through guided psychedelic experiences or otherwise, how do we become the best versions of ourselves? And then I think through our own evolution, as a byproduct of that, we end up impacting people positively. That's where I
mhm.
land. In spite, there's so much complexity to what you're just talking about, but I always end up in the same place that we have
Yeah.
to make decisions for ourselves. In spite of the craziness out there and how cool it is to explore this, it becomes somewhat mundane of like, well, what's the trauma you're still working with?
Yeah.
Why do you still have anxiety? What's really going on
Yeah.
that's holding you back from your potential? It always ends
Yeah.
up there.
Yeah. I think that's really, really well said and insightful. And I think in some ways, like awakening is a deeper intimacy with the human experience rather than like escapism, you know. This is something that you speak to in another one of your books, and end upside down living. For you, kind of on a personal level, Mark, how has kind of integrating this new awareness of the nature of reality affected you in kind of a daily lived sense?
Yeah, so you're referring to my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, which I wrote at an interesting time. I wrote it right after I decided to leave my job. So this was right before everything with COVID and before the lockdowns. But I was in this transitional state where I had a few years of a transformation, going from a materialist, feeling like a zombie in life, to wow, there's a lot of meaning here. These phenomena are real. Consciousness, I don't think it comes from the brain. So much so that I'm going to leave my firm where I spent 10 years and had become a partner and was in this great position in my early 30s. I'm deciding to leave because I don't feel aligned anymore with that.
Mm, mm,
That's where I was when I wrote this book, An End to Upside Down Living. What I was trying to do was to take the next step after an end to upside down thinking of, well, what are the real implications for daily life and actually approaching
yeah,
life if you believe that reality is not what we're told? And for me, the analogy I use in the book is about aligning a compass. And if we set a compass for life, that becomes basically the guiding principle. And previously, before I started researching all this stuff, I didn't even have a compass because I didn't think there was a reason to have one because we're all going to
mm,
die and it's all random. Why even create a compass? Just
mm,
live. Versus, okay, no, I actually want to orient my life in a certain direction, and that's going to guide where I go. And in the end of that book, I describe where the compass is set. And I say, this is my current version. I use the word current very intentionally because that was back in 2020. And I sometimes go back and look at it and people bring up to me, what did you write there? And largely I agree with it. And I think because they're very fundamental principles about basically becoming a vessel of service. But we do that by perfecting our own self, which is along the lines of what I was describing before, of doing the work,
yeah,
however you need to do it. to get to the version of where we're the cleanest vessel to then be of service to the rest of people. So it's kind of paradoxical, because I do think it's very much focused on the individual so that you can then impact the collective, but we can't ignore one or the other. And sometimes there can be a tendency to just say, I don't care about myself, I'm just going to help the collective. Well, actually, if you help your individual self, you can be much better equipped to then impact the collective. But also, you don't want to just focus on the individual and not the collective. So there's a balance in it. But maybe a way I would summarize it now, as we talk in 2024, is that my compass is oriented toward the truth, whatever the truth is, because then we can shed the falsehoods and then know more about what we're here to do.
Yeah.
And it does relate to what I said before of being the cleanest vessel to then be of service. But I do think the truth might be even more fundamental than that, because once we get to the truth, it bleeds into being of service to the collective. But like it's something about shedding falsehoods. And that's what a lot of this conversation's been about. It's what my work has been about over the last, I don't know how many years, is what did I used to believe is true, and now I no longer believe it to be true. And I actually feel more comfortable with that than saying I know what is true with certainty. And in the Hindu tradition, there's a principle known as neti neti, not this, not that. And you get to the truth about reality by shedding falsehoods. It's a process of elimination, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I feel like I am more and more, because knowing what the truth is, it's really hard to do. But we can do analyses to say, well, this thing that they told us isn't true. And the more we do that, I think the more we are in resonance with the truth. Because not being in resonance with the truth, who knows what that does to us in terms of harming our consciousness, misdirecting it, but maybe even our physical health and our emotional health. If there's some part of us that knows we're living a lie, but consciously we haven't gotten there to know that, it might be harmful to us. So shedding the falsehoods, getting closer to the truth, I think that's ultimately, that's the highest goal. And then everything else flows from that we could spend many hours talking about in terms of what you actually do. But it starts with the truth.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. It brings to mind this idea of like alignment, or like kind of coming into alignment with, what some might call the Tao or the Great Spirit, or, whatever one wants to call it. Would you characterize like aligning yourself to the truth and kind of setting your compass in that way as a spiritual practice for you?
Yeah, totally spiritual practice. And sometimes it might not look like that. It might look like me evaluating the fundamentals of physics and cosmology, or looking at fundamentals of medicine or politics or something. But really, all of those exercises, even though they're disparate, is trying to get to the truth and pull back the layers of the falsehoods. So I do feel like that's what's guiding me more and more, and maybe has been guiding me since the beginning, that alignment.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there was a part of me that knew certain things just didn't feel right. If I think back to my old mindset, pre-2016, there was a part of me that I feel now that was still there. Like that fundamental consciousness, I don't think has changed. And I do think that there was a part of me that knew something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And I didn't even know where to start looking or even how to articulate it. But in hindsight, I must have known. So I think that part of us exists probably within every person.
Yeah.
Wait, something's not right. We don't know the full truth here. What is it? Well, how am I out of alignment?
Yeah. It speaks to the power of intuition. Yeah. What role does as in your kind of ontological worldview, what role does intuition play?
Intuition's a tough one, because again, I can't point to it and can't draw it for you. I find it as it's like a trial and error process. Where something comes into my system that feels like information, that I'm being guided to something. But the problem is that there's a lot of noise often, whether it's the body getting in the way or even thoughts. And it's like, well, how do I know what's intuition versus the noise? And over time, what I find is through trial and error, I can try to act on an intuition based on whether or not I think it's an intuition, and see what the result is. And then over time, I can say, okay, now I know what an intuition feels like for me. And for each of us, it might be a little bit different. For some of us, it might just be general knowing. Another person, you might feel something in your body physically, a sensation. You might hear something. It's hard to describe because we all seem to know in different ways or have different ways of tapping in. But I think there's some part of us as a physical entity that is tapping into a greater knowledge that's not coming from the brain, but is perhaps received by it or processed by it or filtered by it, that only each of us can know what that is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, just a little more forward looking. Like I'm wondering like how you envision the future of research into consciousness and the nature of consciousness. Is there anything that you hope might be uncovered or discovered in that realm during your lifetime?
Hmm. I want to be optimistic here, but I just know realistically the kind of funding that's required to get to really conclusive results. You need replications all over the world for these kinds of findings, and you need lots of different types of experimentation because we're not just talking about telepathy. We're talking about near-death experiences and remote viewing and precognition and energy healing. There's just so many tentacles where we could take this place. Dreams, psychedelics, UAP contact, screen memories. Like we could list a million things that need to be studied. And how do we actually find the funding to do this with credible people and then have the right kinds of review of the studies? So I think there will be some funding of it, and there currently is. So we're going to have to take what we can get. And then there are going to be a lot of anecdotal experiences and trying to sift through what we can take from that and corroborate and cross-examine the experiences to see where the Venn diagram, so to speak, overlaps, where the circles have overlap in terms of validating these types of experiences. And I do think there are more and more of them these days. And there's actually a podcast that was very influential for me. It's called Buddha at the Gas Pump,
Yeah.
especially as I was studying spiritual awakening, where you can just listen to person after person having spiritual experiences and you see the commonalities. And these are not people who are related to each other. They're all over the world, very different backgrounds often. And it's like he's done hundreds of interviews, Rick Archer, and people are having such similarities. Not all identical, but it's obvious to anyone who would listen to that podcast for a while. And that's just, I mean, there are many books written on this too. So I do think as more and more people speak out about this stuff, and as there's an increased frequency of experience, there will be shifts.
Mm, mm. Are you hopeful for the future of humankind?
Hmm. I would say it's actually less of a concern for me, paradoxically. The future of humankind seems beyond, so far beyond the control of any individual, or even like small groups of individuals, because humanity is comprised of individual humans. And each person, like I was saying before, is going to have to take responsibility to elevate in consciousness. And it's so hard to predict whether or not people are going to want to take that responsibility and take the time and energy to do this kind of work because it can be painful. And it's also time consuming in that living in the world today requires making a living and taking care of one's family and all these sorts of things. So actually, you'd have to carve out a lot of time in your life to want to do this work too. And that's remains to be seen. Are people going to want to do that? So I do think podcasts like this are super important because someone might just hear one line. This is what happened to me. I was listening to podcasts, changed my whole life. It reoriented me immediately. It was like the first domino that falls. So I do think getting the information out there is highly critical because you never know who's going to hear something or when. It could be 10 years someone from now, someone hears this conversation. It has an impact. So I do think sharing is important. It's why I write books and I do podcasts like this and give lectures. And each of us will do it in a different way. So we're both doing it in a public way here, but not everyone has to do it that way. It could just be in your own family or in your friend group where you're sharing things in a tactful way that has a positive impact. I mean, before I started writing, I remember having lots of like just dinners and brunches with people in San Francisco with just like friends. And I would throw in some things out. Like they say, Mark, what have you been up to? Well, I've been researching this stuff that is changing my life. And I'd like talk about the University of Virginia, studying these little kids, talking about things that they should have no knowledge of that relates to a past life. And I would just get such blown away responses from people. And sometimes they'd say they would go about their lives, but I would get text messages saying like, wow, Mark, I'm still thinking about our conversation. Or next time we'd see each other, they'd be like, well, I'm still working, but I can't get out of my mind that thing you told me about. So there are lots of ways that we can all contribute, but it always starts with us doing our own work, and then we become better vessels for it. And where that leads, it's almost less of a concern for me because I can't control that. What I do have direct control over is my own stuff. So that's where I'm focused first and foremost.
Yeah, it brings to mind this idea of like the fundamental interconnectedness of all things, all beings, all humans, of course, and fascinating research which I've heard you discuss out of Princeton University and the PAIR research lab, the Engineering Anomalies Research Lab that was doing these experiments into the kind of synchronization of the human collective consciousness when global events were happening, affecting the output of random number generators.
Yeah. Pretty wild stuff. So these are machines that generate ones and zeros in a random fashion. And basically, the results of the studies have been interpreted to suggest that the human mind can influence the behavior of these machines. And in fact, the behavior of the machines can be influenced even if a person doesn't know that their consciousness is having an impact. It's called the Global Consciousness Project. It's a spin out of the work that was done at Princeton, which, by the way, was going on when I was an undergrad there. I didn't know it existed. It was very much under the radar, and it was only allowed, as I've understood it, because Dr. Robert John was the dean of engineering there, and he was so highly credible that they allowed him. They couldn't tell this guy not to have a little lab. But it was clearly not, I don't think it was welcomed by the mainstream academic community. And the Global Consciousness Project sets up these machines all over the world. And the researchers look at what happens to the behavior of the machines when there's a major global event that they would theorize would affect many people's consciousness in a strong way. So 9/11, Princess Diana's death, events like that. And what they find repeatedly is that the machines behave non-randomly all over the world at the time of those events. Actually, with 9/11, it was a little bit before, so it suggested precognition potentially. But in general, these are just wild findings that collective consciousness can affect a physical system, even if the effect is really, really small. So the point here is that if consciousness is the basis of reality, it would make sense logically that the reality that we call physical, which might not even be actually physical, but we call it physical, that it's malleable, that is affected by the individual consciousnesses and maybe by other things also. So that's a powerful idea that we might actually be affecting humanity by doing our own improvements in our own consciousness, because when one whirlpool changes, by definition, you've affected the whole stream, so to speak.
It's such a juicy idea, but it really just this visceral sense that by moving towards truth, by kind of doing our own work, working towards healing, towards generating more love and kindness and compassion and awareness within ourselves, that has a real, meaningful, concrete, significant impact on people around us and the world around us. It ripples on and on outwards. Maybe even interdimensionally.
Yeah.
Mark, there are so many more questions that I would love to ask you. There's so many other domains that we didn't even begin to touch on. I mean, from energy healing to mind body to placebo to artificial intelligence, all these things I would really love to ask you, but of course want to be respectful of your time and just say thank you so very much, Mark, for all you do and all you are and all your writing and all your work and everything that you've been sharing. It's made a real impact in my life and for many, many people. So thank you for taking the time to be here with me today.
Thank you for the kind words, Jonas. Thank you for having me on, and I really appreciate the work you're doing in the world as well.